Well, again, good morning. I want to say a big word of welcome. Lots of new faces here today. I want to say a word of welcome. If this is your first day at Christ the Redeemer, I want to say welcome. Perhaps you are hungry. Perhaps you heard that we're in a series, which we're in, but whatever brings you, I want to say welcome. We're all hungry, and that's the series. Week 2 in a series entitled, I Want to Be Fed. We all want to be fed. We've heard those words lots of times. If you have heard those words, or maybe even if you said these words, maybe that's what brought you here today. Just want to say welcome. We often hear it kind of spun the other way. Lots of people have said to us, perhaps I wasn't being fed. Sometimes we hear that echoed in some very personal relationships. Could be our spouse or our kids, our grandkids. Many people that perhaps we have known have left the Catholic Church, or left religion in general, maybe aren't going to Mass because they weren't being fed. And if that's any of us here today, I just want to say welcome. Great to have you with us today. Last week in this series, we kind of jumped into the Bible and we looked at Psalm 23. And we asked the question last week, who's supposed to feed us? Who's responsible for feeding us if we want to be fed? And what the Bible said, through the image of a shepherd and the sheep, is that it's Jesus' responsibility to feed us, right? The shepherd was responsible for leading the sheep. The shepherd is responsible for feeding the sheep. So last week, we answered the question. It's Jesus' responsibility to feed us. So then the question is, well, then how is it that Jesus wants to feed us? And for that today, I'd like us to listen to the answer as we listen to three people. The eyewitness, the skeptic, and the grandfather. Each of them wants to be fed. Each of them has been in conversation with each other for a long time. Who's supposed to feed us? That's Jesus. How does he want to feed us? Well, we're going to start with the eyewitness who was there, the skeptic who struggles to believe him, and the grandfather who's got some wisdom for both of them. Let's start with the eyewitness. His name is John. And John was there. John, who wrote the gospel that we read today. John, who wrote the book of Revelation, also wrote 3 letters. Those 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, all precede almost immediately the book of Revelation in the Bible. John was there. He saw it. He is an eyewitness. John saw Jesus feed the masses. Jesus is going to be responsible for feeding us. It was John as an eyewitness who saw how Jesus wants to feed us. Now, John, when he tells us the story today, he uses some very particular language. John does not call the multiplication of the loaves and fish a miracle. He uses a different word. He uses the word sign. So in the Bible, when we are referring to the multiplication of the loaves and fish, the sign is important for us to pay attention to. Why does John, the eyewitness, use the word sign instead of miracle? Well, what is a sign? A sign is something real that points us to a reality somewhere else. Let me say that again. A sign is something real that points us to a reality somewhere else. You're driving on Highway 90, and you're going from New Orleans to Thibodaux, and you see the sign on the highway that says Thibodaux this way. Is the sign real? Yes, it's really there. It physically exists. Are you in Thibodaux? No, you're on Highway 90. The sign points you to a reality that's somewhere else. And when you get to Thibodaux, you realize the reality that the sign is pointing you to. Whenever John in the Bible uses the word sign, as he did today, he's talking about something happening that's pointing to something else. So, for example, the first sign referenced in the gospel today is all those people saw the sign of Jesus healing. That sign points us to the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. We saw the sign of the multiplication of loaves and fish. That was a real thing. And the eyewitness who saw the sign, he says it's pointing us to another time when Jesus is going to take bread to feed people. And what's significant about the sign is that God can work miracles. He's not bound by physical limitations. Jesus can feed 5,000 people all at once, pointing us to the fact that Jesus today can feed 1.2 billion Catholics who are at Mass today on Sunday across the world. The sign that the eyewitness saw says that Jesus uses the physical things of this world. Now let's wrap our mind around that. Jesus is not bound by the physical. Say that with me. Jesus is not bound by the physical. Jesus is not bound by physical limitations. Say that with me. Jesus is not bound by physical limitations. He uses the physical because of our limitations. Say that with me. He uses the physical because of our limitations. Jesus is not bound by physical limitations, but he uses the physical because of our limitations. On this side of heaven, on this side of heaven, we are limited. We want to see him, touch him, taste him, feel him, but we are limited in how we are able to do that. So Jesus uses the physical. Jesus uses bread, he uses wine, physical things so that we can touch, taste, and feel him, but he's not bound by, he's not limited by those physical things. And that's what we see from the eyewitness. The eyewitness was there. The eyewitness says, I saw it. It happened. And the eyewitness is saying to us today that Jesus wants to feed us today with the Eucharist. The eyewitness is saying that Jesus is active today. And the skeptic hears that. And the skeptic says, I don't see that. The skeptic says, all right, I believe you. You were there. But you were there 2,000 years ago. Now, the skeptic may disagree with the Bible. He might disagree with Jesus. We'll get into that later on. But most skeptics, maybe some of us here today, and if that's you, awesome. Great for you to be here. The skeptic says, hey, I believe it happened back then. But the skeptic struggles to see him today. This is what the skeptic says. The skeptic says, I don't see Jesus alive today. The skeptic says, you want to know what I see? I see cancer. I see the Holocaust. I see evil in the world. I see bad things happening to good people. I see little kids who get diagnosed with cancer. I see car accidents happen. I see all kinds of things happening. The skeptic says, I don't see what you see. Let me tell you what I see. I see bad things happening in the world. And the skeptic says, I don't believe that he's in this world if he's allowing all that in the world. That's the skeptic. And if you've ever asked those questions, good for you to be here. Welcome. That's a good question. The skeptic says, I don't feel anything. Tastes like bread. Tastes like wine. The skeptic says, I don't feel that. Here's what the skeptic says. The skeptic says, let me tell you what I feel. I feel overwhelmed. I feel emptiness. I know anxiety. I know pain. So the skeptic looks at the eyewitness and says, sorry, I don't see Jesus active in the world. The skeptic struggles with three things. Number one, the skeptic struggles with evil. The skeptic struggles with tragedy, and the skeptic struggles with suffering. The skeptic, very in touch with life. The skeptic knows the struggle of life. The skeptic sees evil in the world, the absence of good, right? The skeptic sees tragedy, car accidents, cancer, all kinds of things, right? The skeptic sees suffering. When you see your kids addicted, when you see your parents aging, everything in the middle, right? So there's three types of difficulty for the skeptic: evil, tragedy, suffering. The skeptic will not believe that Jesus is real. I mean, the skeptic believes that God's real. Like, after I die, then I'll see God. But the skeptic will not believe the eyewitness unless his questions are answered. And the eyewitness just keeps talking about what he saw Jesus doing. And the skeptic's got good questions. Good questions. If I might speak to the skeptic for a minute, the question is not the questions. The skeptic is, where are you going for the answers? That's a good question. Where is a skeptic taking their questions? Now, I'm a big believer that if you want truth, it's got to stand the test of time. I'm not interested in some cool latest thing that's going to be forgotten tomorrow. I want something that's going to endure the test of time. And the struggle in the skeptic is the skeptic doesn't trust the older generations. And I lament that. Here's the thing. Every generation thinks that the generations above it are wrong. I don't care what generation you're in. Whatever generation you're in, at some point you thought the generations ahead of you were wrong. Now, to say that everything that the generations ahead of you said was wrong would be as equally foolish as saying that everything that the generations ahead of you said was right. They're not all wrong and they're not all right. But I would love for the skeptic for a moment, just for today, to look to the grandfather. Life can teach you some things if you let it. The struggle is you got to let it teach you. And the struggle is that the classroom of life is sometimes in some tough things that the skeptic can't find God in. The skeptic knows pain, but the skeptic is struggling to learn from life. And that's what the grandfather can teach us. See, the grandfather's been around a long time. Grandfather's got wisdom. If life can teach you, the more you've been on earth, the more you learn, right? This is what wisdom would say to the skeptic about God. Wisdom tells the skeptic that you can run from suffering, but you can't hide. Wisdom tells the skeptic suffering's a part of life. And the skeptic's been seasoned by its skepticism, and the grandfather's been seasoned by learning. Here's what the grandfather knows. Now, this is going to be the hardest thing that you're going to hear me say today. So everybody listen up. He did not come to remove suffering. Wrap your brain around that. Jesus Christ did not come to annihilate suffering. Trusting that God has come into our life to redeem suffering so that we're not alone in the suffering. That's the beauty of it, that we're not alone in the suffering. He's redeemed suffering. To prove the existence of God by the annihilation of suffering would be to limit God in the category of performance or provision. He is not some disengaged puppet master who is on the other side of heaven, who sits there and says, I'm going to get rid of this and get rid of that so we can just go live our life all by ourselves. He didn't. You see, this is what the grandfather knows about life. Everybody pause for a second. You see all these bricks? Look at the bricks behind you. See all the bricks? I want you to look at the bricks right now, okay? How many bricks in church? Don't answer that question. Your life on earth. This is what the grandfather will tell you. Your life on earth is right here. This speck. You're going to live on earth, this speck. You're going to live in heaven for all the bricks. That's what the grandfather knows. The grandfather knows, wisdom knows, that Jesus came to be with us. Jesus came to enter suffering. Jesus came to be in relationship with us, right on the side of it. Let me tell you the truth to the skeptic if I can. The skeptic hates suffering because the skeptic feels alone in the suffering. The skeptic wants to blame God for the suffering because the skeptic is trying to manage the suffering by him or herself. And what wisdom says to the skeptic is, hey, you're not alone. Jesus Christ did not come at Christmas for Santa. Jesus Christ came at Christmas not to annihilate suffering. Jesus Christ came among us so that we might know that God is not invisible, that he's not far off. He is so close that you can touch him and feel him, and guess what? He entered into every human existence. And the grandfather says to the skeptic, hey brother, life is going to be hard, but you can't blame it on him. Evil exists because it's the deprivation of good. People choose to reject God. There are consequences to sin, and that's what we call suffering. And sometimes tragedies happen because the world is not perfect. It's not going to get perfect till we get to heaven. And what the grandfather says to the skeptic is this: you can't find your ultimate meaning of life by looking to earth. Won't happen. The grandfather says to the skeptic, there's more. And you're not alone. And for a moment, the skeptic looks at the grandfather and says, if I'm not alone, what do you want me to do with all this suffering? And the grandfather says to the skeptic, would you be willing to look at the eyewitness for a moment? And the skeptic says to the grandfather, what does he have to do with my suffering? And the eyewitness says, I wasn't just there on the day when he multiplied loaves and fish. The eyewitness, John, was there this day when he suffered, when he entered suffering. And the eyewitness looks at the skeptic and said, I saw him suffer for you. Whatever you're struggling with in life right now, you're not alone. But if you're waiting for the suffering to be annihilated, it's fruitless. We can run from the suffering. We can numb the suffering. That ain't working. It's not going to help us with being fed. He just says to the skeptic, he is with you, carrying the burden of the suffering. And that's why he feeds us in our bodies with his presence. Most of us will have flashes of being the witness. Most of us will have moments when we have the wisdom from the grandfather. But most of us here today know somebody who's suffering. Most of us know pain. Most of us know that bad things happen to good people, that your marriage is going to be hard. Your kids, it's going to be difficult. When you're younger, you're not going to feel understood. Whatever it is, whether it's old or young, most of us know the suffering of the skeptic. And the question for you today is, where are you going with the suffering? We have a choice to make right now for some of us. We can try to carry suffering all by yourself the rest of your life, and you know what that feels like. Or today, for a moment, you can invite him into the suffering by inviting him into your heart as you receive the Eucharist. And if we do that, we will find that not only does he feed us, but even more importantly, that he is with us. Amen.